All right, so now we are going to get into our main discussion. For those of you who are just joining us, I want to thank you again for taking part in the Newsroom at Home webinar. My name is Sharon Ross, and I am the Marketing Manager at Bay Area News Group. We'll start the conversation in just a few moments, but I want to go over some housekeeping notes with you guys before we get started. First of all, if you would like to ask questions during the webinar, please be sure to use the Q&A feature found on your Zoom toolbar at the bottom. I do expect there to be lots of questions, as this is a very hot topic, so we will do our best to get to all of your questions just throughout the event. I also would like to let you know that our next event will be a 5-part gardening series. The first episode will be about planting indoors, and it will be held on November 12th, right here via Zoom at 10 a.m. We're still finalizing some details, so please check back in a couple of days for the registration link on our events pages at mercurynews.com/events, eastbaytimes.com/events, or marinij.com/events. The last thing I want to mention is that we have added a short survey to the end of this webinar. We're always looking for ways to improve the Newsroom at Home experience. So we ask that you do take 2 minutes out of your time to fill out the quick poll. We would really appreciate your feedback. Again, that is at the end of the webinar, and any feedback you give will be helpful for us to make the Newsroom at Home experience better for you all. So now let's go ahead and get started. I would like to introduce our host for the hour, Bay Area News Group's President and Publisher, Sharon Ryan.
Thank you, Charnel, and hello and welcome to this installment of our Newsroom at Home series, Endorsements, How and Why We Make Our Selections. Like Charnel said, my name is Sharon Ryan, and I'm the President and Publisher of the Mercury News and the East Bay Times. Our election coverage is one of the most important things we do. It's certainly one of those that I'm most proud of, our contribution to the communities of the Bay Area. No other media company provides the breadth and depth of election coverage that we do. Again, all in the service to you, our constituents in the Bay Area. I'll be your facilitator today, and I'm here with Dan Borenstein, who leads our editorial efforts for the East Bay Times, and Ed Clendaniel, who leads our efforts for the Mercury News. Today, like the title of the session suggests, we're going to discuss our endorsement work, how and why we make our selections. What we're not able to do today is talk about any specific election or specific proposition. You'll hear that we've so far, Ed and Dan have written over 130 endorsements for this election, and the amount of time we have over the next hour just doesn't allow us to get into those kind of details. So without further ado, I'd like to start by just introducing Ed and Dan to you all. And I'll start with Dan. Dan Borenstein is an award-winning columnist who's worked for the East Bay Times and its affiliate newspapers since 1980, including previous assignments as political editor, Sacramento Bureau Editor, Projects Editor, and Assistant Metro Editor. A Bay Area native, he holds a master's degree in public policy and journalism from the University of California, Berkeley. Ed Clendaniel has been on the editorial board since 2003. Prior to that, he worked on the perspective section for 10 years. A native of Walla Walla, Washington, I love saying that, he has lived in the Bay Area since 1985. Ed is married and has 3 children, and as his background, his Zoom background testifies, when he's not on the job, he loves hiking the Bay Area's beautiful trails. So I'm going to kick things off, and before I do, I just wanted to remind and reiterate what Charnel said. Our goal is really today to answer as many questions as you all have. And so we'll make sure that, or I'll try to make sure that we get time for those in the next hour. So let me start by asking Ed or Dan to comment on, as journalists, we often talk about our mission to serve our communities by reporting unbiased facts. But then in the same newspaper, we have editorial pages that seem to contradict that goal by providing an opinion. Can you, using the context of our election coverage, explain to the difference between the news side of our operation and the editorial side of our mission?
You want to take that, or you want me to go ahead?
I'll start. You know, there's a wall that exists between our news side and our opinion side. And once you understand the mission, in my mind, of our opinion pages, then you understand why it's not a contradiction in my thinking. The reason, the mission of our editorial page is to have debates on the issues that are the most important issues before our community. And I take that very seriously. I take that more seriously than the issue of trying to influence people with our own opinions, which is something we try to do as well. But if you're going to have that debate on the most important issues and have a place for it, then you have to have, you know, a wealth of opinions from a wealth of different people, letters to the editor, commentary pieces, syndicated columnists from people on both sides of the issue. And so, you know, while people want the facts, and our news coverage does a great job of that for elections and for everything else, what we're trying to do is different. And what we're trying to do is be that place where we can talk about the issues and try and resolve them and help resolve them for our community. Dan, you want to add?
Yeah, no, I totally agree. That's exactly right. You know, we want to stimulate discussion. The news pages are where you go to get the background facts and find out what's going on, you know, with these issues. When you come to the opinion pages, it's to engage in thought about what should we do about these issues of the day. What needs to be done? How do we make society better? I sort of think of it as the news pages are the place where you get informed, and then the editorial pages are the places where you think about what kind of activism, if you will, you want to take. What do you think? What do we do to make society better? And I think that's part, and I totally agree with that. We're the starting point. Our editorials are the starting point for discussion, and from there, it's up to people to chime in and add on. And if we stimulate thought, if we stimulate discussion at your dinner table or wherever it may be, that's a win. That's what we want to accomplish.
Thank you. Thank you both for that response. And I would just add, you know, because we did get a lot of questions about that around that topic. Why do we do endorsements at all? Why don't we just do the facts in the news pages and let you know, everybody decide for themselves? And so just summarizing, you know, some of the things that you both said, it really, the editorial pages are about, the mission is to stimulate discussion, stimulate debate, be able to ask the tough questions, and really get thought out there and get people thinking. You don't have to agree, but if we've succeeded, if we've gotten people to have conversations, like Dan said, around the dinner table or with or around a glass of wine, that's really our mission. And if we do that, then we feel like we've been successful.
And I think it's important, Sharon, that we explain to people that there's a wall there, you know, between that that what we write on the opinion pages does not affect, it does not influence what's written in the news pages. I think it's very important. We keep those opinions to the editorial page. It does not seep into our news coverage.
Yeah, and the reverse is true. I would never try and tell the newsroom what they should or should not cover. If I have a hot tip, I'm going to share it. But you know, whether they write about it or not, that's their call. And at the same time, I do not get, the news side folks do not come to me and say, oh, you should take this opinion on this issue. In the first place, I wouldn't allow it. And in the second place, you know, that would be going through the wall that exists, and it's just not appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you. Moving on to, for this election, the Mercury News and the East Bay Times wrote over 130 endorsements on national, state, and local elections. The endorsements included individual candidate races for the state legislature, city councils, school boards, as well as a wide range of state and local propositions. We know that this is only a portion of the items that are going to be on the ballot this year. Can you tell us, maybe start with you, Ed, can you tell us a little bit about how you decide which races and which propositions to cover and which you're not going to be able to?
It's a really hard decision. We agonize about it all the time. We want to do all of them. First off, we always are going to do the state propositions because we think it's very difficult for people to get an understanding of them all. And if we have time to read every word of every proposition and interview people on each side, we think we're doing readers a real service of doing that. Then on the local races, we have to make tough calls on which ones I think are the ones that are most important to our community. Every year, there's ones that I'm delighted I'm able to get to, even the bigger ones to the smaller ones. One of the ones I really wanted to make sure we did this year was the Allen Rock School District, which has had immense troubles over the years. And maybe, a very small portion of our readers are going to vote on that issue. But that's a crucial election for the people on the east side and for the children there. And we wanted to make sure that we did that. There are tough calls. There's races we can't do this year. I've had calls from any number of people, candidates and readers, wanting to know if we can do those races. And, at some point we have to make the decision on what we can and can't do because of the time factor. But what we're trying to do is we try and prioritize the most important elections first, and then get to as many as we possibly can.
And I think we also, I don't know, at least in the East Bay, and I think it's true with you, Ed, too, Ed, we're looking also for agencies, city councils or school boards where they're having trouble, where we want to get below the surface and try and find out why is that, and are there candidates who could help make this better? There's some school districts in the East Bay that we've been consistently doing over the last decade that may not be as high in terms of the actual number of readers or actual population, but they're troubled or they have serious issues, and we want to get below the surface and see if we can influence getting candidates into office who can begin to fix these problems. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I just said the other thing that I think people really do understand, unlike national, even statewide races for candidates, we're not going to have that much influence on how they're flooded with information about that from multiple sources. But it's in the smaller races. Those are the ones that people don't have the information, may not have the insights, and those are the ones we think that we both probably have more influence, and we take that really responsibility seriously. But also, those are the ones where people need the most help as voters in determining how they should vote, and also sparking debate again on issues that are very important to those communities.
And it's unfortunate that every year I feel like the list of races we want to do gets longer, and the time doesn't. Yeah. And so we keep having to make really tough choices as to what we're going to cover and where we're going to take the time to endorse and where we just don't have it. Because we don't want to just do a slapdash job of just running through it. We want to talk to the candidates. We want to dive into the ballot measures and make sure we really understand them and we really have a solid feeling as to what the plan should be.
I made a point this year of doing more city council races, I think, than the newspaper has done in more than 25 years. And the reason for that is that because this region has had some major challenges, and we've been trying to take a regional approach to transportation issues, housing issues, but those only work if the cities within them also make progress on those issues in a way that works for them as well. And so if we're going to talk about regional issues throughout the year on our editorial pages and what we should be doing regionally, it's really important that city councils have candidates and that we pay attention to issues in those communities that work for them as well as for the communities and for the council candidates themselves.
Good, thank you. And both sides, what you talked about was for the choosing smaller races and that where people don't maybe have the information or access to candidates. So really informing on small local races is key, critical. And then, like you said, just the major statewide propositions, it's so complicated and there's so much spin out there I think, you know, we wrote a story about how much money is being poured into these, and it's, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars. So it's really very difficult to understand and weed through all that for, you know, average voter. So both of those reasons are very important to select endorsements. I'd like to ask the next question, and Dan, if you'd comment on, so once you do decide what you're going to focus on and which candidates or which ballot measures you're going to write about, how do you go about that? What's your process, and how do you do your due diligence?
Yeah, I think, you know, and let's talk about the local ballot measures, 7 of them. With cases, what we generally do is, and it's been by Zoom this year, of course, but we set up a session with all the candidates in a particular race at one time. I like to see them all at once so that I can see how they interact with each other, and so also so that I can quickly see comparisons between them. But before I even get to that meeting, I've usually spent a few hours talking to public officials. Sometimes it's the staff, sometimes it's elected officials. There's a questionnaire I usually send to each city because I want to understand where their finances are right now. So that when I come into those meetings, I like to feel like I know the numbers and I know, you know, the issues really well, and I know where the latest is on them. I often find that I know more about what's going on in the cities than the candidates themselves, which sometimes can be frustrating, to be honest. But in terms of the ballot measures, for the local ballot measures, especially for the tax measures, I have a system where every tax measure that's on the ballot, the city officials will receive a questionnaire from me. And this started because 10 and 12 years ago, we started discovering that there were ballot measures, for example, bond measures, where there was no analysis of the long-term costs and whether this financing made good sense or not. And so, and I do happen to have a little bit of background in some of this. So I wanted to see, we asked for information on, for example, with the bond measures, show me what the payoff is. What's the interest what are the interest costs going to be? What is this money going to go for? What are the voters getting for it? Is it something, you know, I often compare it to home mortgage, for example. Is it something where you're taking out a home mortgage and it's for 50 years? Well, that doesn't make sense. Is it something where it's backloaded on the interest payments? That's just costly to the taxpayers. Those are the kind of details I want to see in the information when I review tax measures, especially bond measures.
I'd add to that and just say that we go through a similar process. Dan is an incredible reporter. Most people don't understand the level of reporting that goes on in editorial writing. It's not just a matter of reading stories and then coming up with an opinion. We do intensive research as well for all of the candidates. We ask them to fill out questionnaires. We do like to see them come in. One of the things I would add to what Dan said, in addition to all the issues he talked about in terms of the research and effort that goes into it, I like to see the candidates, you know, interacting with each other. And I like to see how they respond to some personal questions as well. Because I find that being a good, effective politician is all about relationships. And someone can be very strong on the issues, but if they can't work well with people, and sometimes even their own staffs, they're not going to be effective. And so I'm looking to see something about the person themselves. Who are they? What they really stand for? Are they the sort of person who's going to be effective in office? Because you can know every issue backward, forward, and sideways, and even agree with us on the issues. But if you're going to be totally ineffective in office, then I don't see why we should endorse you.
And I totally agree with what you said, and I would add, you know, part of that is also seeing how they react when challenged, so to speak. You know, how do they react? Do they get defensive? Do they say if they don't know, I don't know, or do they try and fake it? Are they transparent and sincere, and can they develop a rapport not only with me, but do they have thick enough skin to not let their competitors' criticisms send them off the deep end, which sometimes happens.
Yeah, that does happen. But one of the things that I think people will be interested to know that they probably don't know is that I always say, you know, their endorsement interviews are important, yes, but they're not the only chance to talk to us. You know, I always give them the opportunity. Hey, if you felt like you said something, you want to clarify position or get more to the heart of an issue, give me a call, send me an email. And very often candidates will respond, you know, with, you know, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 emails back and forth trying to get to the heart of an issue or how they stand on the issue or how they would react if they were challenged on an issue.
Ed, when do you start doing your research for the endorsements? When did you start doing your research for the endorsements for this election?
The day after 4th of July. You know, I mean, we've been at it 7 days a week, you know, 10, 12 hours a day ever since. I've taken this election more seriously. I think it's the most consequential election of my lifetime. And I'm getting at a point in my career where, you know, I'm thinking legacy, and I'm thinking for the future and for future generations. What are we going to leave them with? And you know, I think it's really important that these elections, we elect good people who will take care of their own communities, will take care of the region, will take care of the state, and then the nation. Because I do think that what happens at the grassroots level is what eventually happens at the national level.
Thank you, Ed. I'm going to turn to a question from the audience, and ask Dan if you would comment on this one. And the question is, do you look at the candidates' financial statements and determine who's funding their campaign? So I think that's a two-part question. Do you look at the candidates' financial statements?
I actually don't tend to, unless somebody's flagged me to a problem. Frankly, because, you know, there's just a limited amount of time, and that's not the first place I want to vet them. I want to vet them more on the issues and what they have to say. But every once in a while, somebody will say, hey, you know, I'll get tipped off that, hey, you should look at this or that. And then I'll go digging. You know, and it's important if there is something that's flagging, sitting out there. I do not, as a matter of course, go through every candidate's Form 700s, which are their financial disclosure statements, to see what they said. Perhaps it's a step we should add in the process. You know, I do ask them for a resume before the endorsement interviews, a traditional job application type of resume, because I want to see what their experience is, what's their education, what they've done, what are their life experiences. And I don't want the sort of veneered campaign summary. What was the second part of the question again, Sharon? I got off and I forgot.
The second part was, do you look into who is funding their campaign?
Sometimes yes. Sometimes, I mean, if it turns out that there's a major funder, I will probably take that into consideration. I don't always find that that's determinative. As a matter of fact, I often, you know, we're trying to make our decisions based on who the best candidate is. That they happen to have big money from one side or the other. You know, I mean, the biggest, perhaps in terms of school boards this year, the best example of that is big money from the unions, big money from charter school advocates, or gets poured into a lot of school board races. And I just know there's big money being poured in from both sides, but that's not, you know, I say, okay, so we know that, but our job is not to figure out who's going to have the most mailers and TV ads. Our job is to figure out basically who has the positions that are closest to where we as an editorial board have been aligned, and who are the most thoughtful candidates.
The only thing I'd add to that would be that I'm also in that situation. I'd agree with a lot with what Dan says, and that's the same sort of approach that we usually take. There's going to be money in elections. People are going to back candidates. What I want to know is a candidate able to stand up and take the right position on an issue, even if it goes against the wishes and will of their backers. And I want evidence of that. I want the candidates to provide examples of the times when they've made those tough decisions, because the very best politicians are the ones who know when they can do that, but are willing to do that on important issues when the situation calls for it. But usually backers back people because they share the same position. So that's not necessarily a negative.
Sure. Thank you. Ed, can you just expand on what you started to say about a little bit about how, so once all the due diligence is done, you've done the interviews, you've talked to the candidate, how do you decide what your position is going to be, and how do you decide which candidate to endorse?
Well, there's a lot of different factors, and that's a really interesting question, and a good question. Sometimes it's easy. Because sometimes the difference between the candidates will just be monumental. It's harder when you have two really good candidates, or as I think Dan alluded to earlier, when you have two candidates who are not so good, and you're having to choose between one or the other. The reason it's more than just a matter of positions, although that's really important. And that's probably the most critical factor. But again, it's effectiveness. And it's about who the person is and what they stand for. Do they have integrity? Can they work well with people? And so you're trying to get to the heart of that. I've had times where I've agonized over decisions, where it's taken, days for me to sort of come to arrive at a position. And so what I'm usually trying to do is talk to people as much as I can, do as much homework as I possibly can, and then make a call, just like voters have to. And that's what we have to do as well.
Yeah, and to that I would add, can they dig deep and see the nuances of issues? Can they really appreciate that even though we may not agree with them, do they understand the important points of the debate, or are they just rattling off talking points from whatever special interest they've heard, or are they just trying to fake it, frankly?
Thank you. I'm going to go to some questions that have come in. And the first one is, do you ever change your mind about an endorsement and write an editorial expressing your changed opinion?
It's rare, because one of the things that we take seriously is the historical component of our paper, be consistent with our values, because I think that's important both for the paper and for us, and for our readers. I can think of twice in the last, I think, 4 years where we've withdrawn an endorsement. It's usually because a candidate has done something egregious in our view, or for some reason along those lines. We do change our minds on some issues. I can think of a couple that are painful memories for you to admit, wow, we were wrong about that, and it's important for us to acknowledge it. And so what we'll try and do is usually write an editorial talking about our original position, why we've had to change of heart, and what our new position is. It's more often a case where we're altering our position as an issue develops. And it's more from a smaller degree of changing, because something new has come up. And so that, and then there are also times when you're like, well, don't let the perfect get in the way of the good, and so we'll accept a position on an issue that we maybe don't exactly like very well, but we know it's in the best interest of the community, so we'll go forward with it. But no, the answer is not very often.
I can think of 2 times in the last decade where in the East Bay we have pulled an endorsement because of candidates' behavior. There have been times when we've been asked to, where things have come up and we've looked at the situation and said, that was perhaps not the smartest move on the candidate's part, but it's not egregious enough to merit withdrawing. I think there's an interesting thing that also happens, Ed, in terms of changing, in terms of policy positions over time, that's important to keep in mind, at least especially for the East Bay, is it's important to consider what the East Bay Times is, and its evolution, because it's been an evolution of a group of different newspapers that over time have merged into one, and they came to that pot, if you will, sometimes with different editorial positions. And so sometimes you're balancing those, you know, I mean, the Oakland Tribune and the Contra Costa Times, the historical papers that are now the biggest part of what's now the East Bay Times, didn't always have the same position. And then of course there's the melding that happened eventually with the Contra Costa Times and the Mercury News. And, you know, historically we had sometimes different positions. So there is this evolution, if you will, which is appropriate because times change and we should be able to change with the times in a measured and appropriate way.
That's uh, a great observation, and definitely agree. And it does lead to the next question that we've gotten, and it's about that kind of evolution, and it's a question to both of you. Looking back on your careers, can you comment on whether on the changes that you've seen in the candidates and the engagement and just the knowledge and the you know, Ed, you talked about passion. What changes have you seen? You've both had long careers in this business. What changes have you seen in the races and the candidates?
For me, the biggest change that I've seen is the advent of social media, which has really changed the game tremendously. And also the internet era where information is much more easily accessible. The research that you had to do for candidates in the past and for issues was much harder than it is now to a degree. And then on other issues, things are much harder now to get at the heart of issues because of social media sort of stamps politicians and candidates into a certain, you know, place, and they just don't budge off of that. They just, you know, state their positions sort of like cookie cutter positions and don't budge from it. So I say social media has been the biggest change. The other big change isn't so much again in the candidates, it's in newspapers, you know, and because we've had some reduced staffing issues, and so it's harder to get at some of the races that we would like to get to. But that'd be my answer.
Yeah, and you know, I think that there have been changes in the candidates, and also I would say in some of the ballot measures, I think that have been influenced by some of the things we've done. You know, I do like to think, and I've been told that, you know, and I have seen, for example, that school bond measures in the East Bay are much more responsibly financed than they were 10 or 12 years ago. And I've been told by some of the consultants, it's because they know that we're going to ask about it now. We didn't know to ask about it 10, 12 years ago. So you know, they're more measured. And some of the candidates come in extremely well versed in some of the financial details that they wouldn't have, and they didn't a decade or more ago. And I think that's in part because they know that they're going to be grilled on it. I'd like to think that that maybe influences a little bit of the change. Maybe what's really influencing them too is that some of the things that we'd warned about a decade or more ago in terms of financial crunches that we're seeing because of unfunded liabilities and other issues are coming to pass, and they're feeling the pain that we warned them they would.
Right. Thank you, Dan. We've gotten a number of questions from different folks about who actually writes the endorsements, the editorials, who's on the team, how many people get to voice their opinions. So could both of you just talk a little bit about and share with the audience who's actually writing the pieces and who's part of the team and whose voice is being heard?
Sure, I guess I can go first. One of the biggest changes that's happened in the last 3 or 4 years is the sort of joining where we mostly agree on issues of the East Bay Times and Dan's work with our work. And so Dan and I write the majority of the editorials. For the more local issues here in the Mercury News in the San Jose and the region around the South Bay, I write all of those editorials. The other people on our editorial board are Sharon and Frank Fine, our executive editor. Dan and I consult every day, and we talk about the issues and what we should be doing and what we're working on. And when we can share editorials, we do that. And when we have a local issue we need to write about, we write about that.
Yeah, and it's you know, on the bigger pieces, we do have a you know, more intense discussion that's usually the four of us, you know, including Sharon and Frank, and it as you know, it can get heated, but it's a good debate and it's important. I think these dialectic processes are good and a good part of the evolution of opinions. We really, you know, what really happened, what's really happened with some of the changes with the two papers is that Ed and I have become, you know, I would say more so than in past years, the two papers work much more closely than they did before. That's in part because of necessity, and it's in part and deficiencies, and it's in part, frankly, because there's no reason not to. We tend to agree on most issues. So on the regional issues, sometimes Ed and I will disagree, and we'll hash it out, and we'll try and find a middle point usually. And I can only think of one time in the last 2.5 or 3 years that we've gone separate ways between the two papers.
Yeah, we hold it, you know, I think it's symbolic as well, the region. I mean, we've become more regional minded as a region, and it's important that we do. And so, you know, we have to think as a region. And so that means, you know, it's important what the East Bay thinks in terms of housing, in terms of transportation. Just like in the East Bay, what happens down here with San Jose and Google and Diridon Station and that transportation hub is important for the folks who are up in the East Bay as well. So yeah, we work pretty strongly. One of the things I want to make sure I mention is that some people will ask me often, well, why are the editorials unsigned if you wrote it? It's never a secret who wrote an editorial. We'll always tell you who wrote it. But the reason we don't sign them is because it is the position of the paper. It's the voice of the paper. And I've mentioned once before that's really important to me in my thinking when I'm writing, that I'm not writing what Ed Clendaniel thinks. I'm writing what the voice of the newspaper, what the newspaper thinks.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And it's a great segue to the next question. You know, even though you said normally there's you know, it's all agreement but there are times that it's not. And so the question is, what happens when the editorial team doesn't agree? Is it majority vote, or do you just not cover the topic?
That's a great question.
That's a great. Maybe you should answer that, Sharon.
Yeah. Well, in my mind, Sharon always has the last word.
Yeah.
But
oh, good answer. I wish that were true.
Well, but what I really appreciate about Sharon and Dan and Frank is that they're good listeners, and we make it into a conversation. And you know, and so, but there's four of us on some of these bigger issues. It's hard to come up with a majority vote. But sometimes one of us will carry the day, and sometimes another one of us will carry the day. And you know, but so we try not to avoid the situation where we turn to Sharon and say, they pay you the big bucks, you decide. Just because the same reason that when Dan and I are working on individual race ourselves, that we may not be going to them on it. What's really important is having the right opinion. That's the most important thing of what we do. As I always tell people before who used to come to the paper and work on our pages, that the most important thing you can possibly do is get the opinion right, because you're going to deal with the opinion for years sometimes, or you can change your mind, but you want to make sure you get it right. So you discuss it through and come up with the best solution you can.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, and I think we really try and aim for a consensus, and almost all the time we eventually do. You know, sometimes it's an iterative process. Sometimes I think both Ed and I, you know, because obviously you know, Sharon's got to run the newspaper operation too. You know, we don't want to call her on a daily basis and say, hey, you know, what do you think about the Mount Diablo School District? But there are times when there are measures or issues that are coming up in either region where, you know, I think both Ed and I feel like we kind of know Sharon's thinking fairly well, but there may be times when I'll pick up the phone and call Sharon, or Ed might, and say, I want to talk to you about this. Here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? And I think that's an important part of the process. It's a check-in. It's also important because it's just another opportunity to make sure that our thinking is all along the same line.
Yeah, one of the things I just add real quickly is that usually when we're starting the endorsement process on issues that I think that Sharon or Frank may want input on, I'll send them a note making sure that I know which issues they want input on. And the other thing is that for local majors, I will often send them a list of what I'm thinking that will go and what I'm thinking our opinion is likely to be, although that can change when you get into the issues and find out, you know, that sometimes the details in them or something about some of the candidates themselves.
Absolutely. Thank you. Next question. This is a good one for both Ed and Dan. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this question. How has the pandemic and shelter in place changed the editorial endorsement process for you this year?
Well, it's interesting. There are two things about it. One is that one of the key criteria I'm looking for in looking for candidates and understanding what's going on with local government agencies is I want to take into consideration how the pandemic is affecting the services they deliver, their finances, people's thinking in the community. It's affecting the politics. There's no question about it. In terms of the logistics, I miss the days of being able to have the candidates in the same room and be able to look them, you know, I mean, you can look them in the eye on a Zoom session, but it ain't quite the same. And, but you know, but that's how we're doing it. We're doing all the interviews now by Zoom. There's one minor little logistical issue that, of course, in in normal times, when they come in for their ed boards, we also have send them to our photo studio. Well, nobody's going to our photo studio right now, so credit our photographers who've done a wonderful job of setting out outdoor photo studios for the candidates, so that we can, because we want to have their photos taken. We want to have their photos for our records.
Well, from my standpoint, I was scared to death of this election for that reason, because I wanted to take this election very seriously, and doing everything by Zoom just scared me to death. I mean, I just thought it wasn't going to be the same, and I was afraid of the cons that we would run into, and I didn't see too many pros, frankly. I'm happy to say that I'm a people person. I want to see people in person. I want to be able to go to lunch with them. I want to be able to go to coffee with them. I want to talk to city managers. I want to talk to, the folks involved. The pro of doing it by Zoom is it's much easier to set up meetings. Everybody's at home. They have more time, and the time availability is much easier than when doing other things. And the other thing about it was that a little bit different from what Dan said, doing things by Zoom, I still think that you really get to the heart of who people are and what they stand for, and being able to have multiple conversations, sometimes late at night and in the evening by Zoom, you get a better feel for people and who they are and what they are. But so I would say on the whole, I still prefer doing it the old way, and maybe I'm a creature of habit and I'm old school. But and the other thing I was scared to death of the technology, by the way. But that's turned out to be okay. And so, on the whole, I'm very comfortable with doing it by Zoom and by doing it by telephone, and it's worked out okay.
Before shelter in place in this election cycle, had you ever done video interviews, or is this completely new?
I never done by Zoom, or we done video where we had taped and even actually live streamed interviews with candidates before. So we had a sense of how that would be like. But I didn't find it much difference, the Zoom interview versus the in-person interview.
We've done some major candidates in the past. We tended to in the past use Google Hangouts,
Yeah.
Which I gather that's not its name I know anymore, but whatever it's called now. But but it is interesting how Zoom took over the pandemic and became the place, the app of choice, you know.
It is interesting, and it does beg the next question, which I'm interested in the answer to. Have you ever endorsed a candidate that has not agreed to be interviewed?
Yes.
Have you?
Yeah, I have. It's pretty rare, but I've done it before. They're usually sort of spatial circumstances. The timing didn't work out for them, or I thought that they had just rejected the chance to interview, or it's usually a situation where the opponent is not very strong. And so I do my homework, do my research. There are some candidates out there, now usually for the smaller, it's usually the school districts or a smaller city, who just, on principle, don't seek endorsements. And so out of principle, they won't seek our endorsement. And so then I usually call and say, okay, so you're not seeking our endorsement. Well, I just want to talk to you. I just want to interview you. And they usually won't do that either, and which is very frustrating, and which makes me wonder about how effective they will be in office. But if you do your homework, some of those candidates are actually, as I'm thinking of one right now, who turned out to be a very good city councilman that we endorse, even though they wouldn't interview with us.
This is, and I definitely differ. I can't think of an East Bay candidate we've endorsed who we haven't talked to, and I'm not sure I'd be comfortable doing it. You know, just
it's rare
I
for us.
want to talk to them.
It's rare, but
Yeah.
but I don't rule it out just by ruling it out. That's it.
Good. So we've gotten a lot of questions, Ed and Dan, about people that are interested in your notes and the information that you've gathered. So I've gotten some questions about, do you tape your interviews? Is the information that candidates send, like their resumes, Dan, that you mentioned, or their disclosure forms, do you gather those? And is there any possibility that do you ever share those with the public or make those open to others to be able to look at?
Okay, I don't tend to record the sessions. Sometimes I do. In years past, I tended to record them more. What I found, frankly, is that I didn't use the recordings very much, and it was more hassle than it was worth, because I take really good typed notes. When I interview, I have my computer, and I'm a very fast typist, and I keep notes that really, other people may not know what they say, but I absolutely know what they say, and what, you know, I understand my typing shorthand. So you know, we did in years past, you know, when it was sort of the thing a lot of papers were doing and there was more staffing, we did videotape a lot of the key interviews and we put them up. We don't really have the staffing, and there wasn't a huge reader demand for watching those videos, as I recall, but we're not doing that this year. The last part of that question was, oh, my notes. No, my notes don't get shared with anybody. Just, you know, that's just a principle as a journalist. The resumes that I ask for, unless there's something egregious in them or where they misrepresented themselves to me, I don't see any purpose in sharing them or putting them up. You know, they were just more information that I asked for. You know, I guess if we had a very sophisticated, organized platform where we could gather resumes from every candidate and in a uniform manner and tell them that they're going to be put up, that would be fine. But frankly, I don't want these candidates to feel like what they're giving me necessarily is just, you know, I don't want them to have to create a new resume, and there may be personal stuff that they don't want up, you know, for the whole public to see. I just use those as a general, okay, what have you done? What's your education? What have you done with your life? That's what I'm looking for. So I'm not sure there's a real public need to share the resumes in detail.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I've been recording the Zoom interviews, interestingly enough, but I'm finding I don't too often go back to them. There's certain times where I have, because it's important. I want to make sure that how did they say that and what was their position again. I want to know that. I also, like Dan, I take extensive notes. One of the gifts, you know, I have my faults, believe me, I know them, but one of the gifts is I'm a voracious reader, and I read very quickly, and I have very good reading comprehension. And like Dan, I also take notes very quickly. And so I think those are huge pluses. If I were to make my notes available, it would be, I can't imagine how they would be all that interesting to people, just in terms of, I mean, it's pretty standard stuff. Most of it is.
Yeah.
There's nuggets in there if you look for them, but I'm with Dan in that when we used to do live streaming, or when we would record interviews, we didn't get too much viewership. Sadly, we expected more. And the amount of effort that went into every time we did that, I would say it would probably mean another race that we'd have a hard time getting to. And it seems like there's a lot more value for us to go after and do as many races as we can, rather than share our notes and take the work and time to do that.
And by the way, one of the things with Zoom that I've been telling candidates, and I used to tell that to them in person when they came in with their iPhones, is I do not permit the candidates to record the sessions. And the reason for that is I don't want these to become where one candidate takes another candidate's comments, because remember, they're all in the same room at the same time, you know, and takes a snippet and turns it into campaign fodder, you know, taken out of context or a quick hit. I want those sessions to be things where people feel like their full thoughts are being heard, and that that things aren't going to be taken out of context.
There's another important thing that we do is I tell the candidates we're on the record for our interviews, but yes, I allow them at any point to go off the record, particularly when they need to explain an issue that can be very sensitive, and explain for why they did this, or why they feel this way, or how they will act in this situation if they need to, as a person, as a council person or a school board member. And so often, most of the time, we just stay on the record the whole time. But when we do go off the record, it's really important that we have the opportunity to do so. And you know, if I were to share my notes, that can get really tricky, because as any person in integrity in our position has to respect when something's off the record versus when it's on the record.
But as a matter of principle, as a journalist, I would never share my notes no matter what.
Yeah, same.
So the confidential nature of the discussion and the conversation really lends itself to people being forthcoming and sharing all the information in an open, honest way.
That's the intent.
Yeah, I hope so. You know, I mean, I think a lot of the candidates who come in for these Bay editorial boards, you know, feel, you know, sometimes they can get questions thrown at them rapid fire. Sometimes they can, you know, be challenged really quickly when they say something, and you know. So, but I think at the other hand, it forces them to suss out their position. Sometimes candidates come in and they just want to give a campaign speech, and I cut them off and say, I don't want to hear the general campaign speech. We don't have time for that. I want to know why you're running,
right.
Really why you're running. I want to know really what you want to accomplish, and I want clear, concise answers to the questions I'm about to ask.
The only thing I'd add to that is that the interaction between the candidates themselves can get pretty interesting. And because I like to see what happens when every once in a while, sometimes I haven't done it this year, but one of my favorite questions to ask is to let one candidate ask a question of the other candidate. What would you ask them? And so the interaction between the candidates is really interesting to me in terms of how they respond, and whether they can respond well to that, how well prepared they are for that, and the opportunity for them to respond to hits from the other candidate is actually important for me to learn, because you'll hear those hits, you'll see those flyers, you'll see all these other things, and trying to get to the heart of those issues is important in terms of making our endorsements.
And the dynamic, by the way, of a two-person race and having two candidates in there versus a field of 5 candidates is night and day. And what you can do with 2 people is completely different than a larger field.
Yeah. The other thing about it, as the host for Zoom meetings with the candidates, and there's 5 candidates in the room, I love the mute button.
I think we're going to see that mute button in action soon on a national stage. So we'll see how that
That's
goes,
right,
right?
tonight.
Yes. It should be interesting. Next question, which is another good one. Do other newspaper endorsements influence how you write your endorsements? Do you pay attention to what other news organizations are saying and endorsing?
Absolutely. I mean, I watch them. I don't know that it influences what we write, but I definitely want to know what they're writing. And sometimes they'll make a point that I hadn't thought of, or they'll have an insight I hadn't thought of. And doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to try and steal it or anything, but I'm going to take it into consideration. Because I think that when you're doing your evaluation of a race, you want all points. Every piece of information you can get is valuable. And so, yeah, I do pay attention to what other newspapers do, but I am going to put in a plug for us because we've done 130 endorsements. By my count, the San Francisco Chronicle is a little bit over 40. LA Times I think, is around 40. Sacramento Bee has a few more than that, but we've done more than double any other newspaper I know of in the state.
I have a slightly different approach to, I watch what the other editorial pages do all the time. I tend to, if it's a topic I'm writing on too, I want to write what I'm going to write first before I look at it, because, and then I might go back and look and say, did they raise any issues that I didn't think about? But what I'm looking not to do is, I don't want, I always worry that I wouldn't want somebody else's wording to start infiltrating my brain. But more importantly, I kind of want to be able to arrive at it independently of what other people think. That said, what Ed said is very important, that you want to make sure you covered all the issues and that you've really thought through all the issues. So it's more a timing thing for me.
Every once in a while, they'll write something really sharp that I really like, and I'll go, "Oh, damn! Wish I thought of that."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and that, and I think, I don't know about you, Ed, but I think we both have probably experienced that both when we worked on the news side too.
Yeah.
That you see the competitor's story and you say, "Darn, I wish I'd thought of that."
Yeah.
Or I'd ask that
Yeah.
question. Yeah.
A brilliant lead or something like that,
Yeah.
or some clever
Sure.
thing or something like that. And because then it's gone for good. You can never use it.
Right.
Good, thank you. We've gotten a number of questions, which I think are also really terrific, about diversity. And so we've talked about who writes the endorsements, who writes the editorials, who's making the decisions. And there's clearly, when you look at the faces, a lack of diversity in our voice. And so, we're being called out on it. And I think it's I'll let both you, Dan and Ed, comment on it, but I'll maybe start and just respond and say, it's a great question and one that we're definitely talking about. I think what's happening in our communities and in the world and our nation really has given me pause, and I think a lot of us, to think about diversity, and are we speaking and representing our communities. And I think what we have right now is lacking. And so we've begun the conversation about how do we bring in other voices and make sure that we're doing the best job we can to represent our communities. So it's a fair question and comment, and I would just say we're working on it, and recognize and are definitely excited to make some change.
Yeah, I would totally agree with what you're saying, Sharon. I think it's a really legitimate question. It's a really legitimate point. I mean, I think it's not only racial and ethnic diversity that's an issue here, but there's some age diversity issues too. I mean, Ed and I are not exactly spring chickens, and there's actually really legitimate questions about the next generation and who's going to come behind us and bringing them in. And it needs to be, we need to be looking at it being more racially diverse, more ethnically diverse, more economically diverse, and also clearly we need to understand that there's this younger voice that we need more of.
Right.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I totally agree. You know, I do a lot of the picking of the syndicated columnists who come in. I've been trying to make a conscious effort for that and for our local commentaries to try to have as diverse a field as we can. It's an unfortunate fact that the field in general is most dominated by white male. I mean, and that has been true since I started in the newspaper business, you know, years ago, that the op-eds and commentaries and columnists are dominated in that arena. It's a huge concern for us because, I mean, we write editorials saying that diversity is important on city councils, on school boards, in the legislature, and then, you know, you look in the mirror and you know you're lacking in that whole area. It's unfortunate. It's something I don't like, but it's reality for right now. And you know, Dan and I aren't spring chickens. There will be people who follow us, and I'm hoping that there will be diverse voices that do too. And if we can continue to make moves and then improve the situation, the status of the paper, maybe one of these days we'll be able to come to Sharon and say, hey, maybe possibly we could add a voice to our pages.
Good. Thank you. Thank you both. And, you know, like I said, I'll just close by saying, you know, absolutely fair questions. We recognize it, and we will, you know, I'll pledge we will do better. We absolutely will. I think we're out of time. Thank you all for spending the last hour with us to talk about our endorsement process. And again, you know, why do we do what we do, and how do we choose, and how do we decide? I'll just close by, you know, putting a plug in for our election coverage. Like I said at the beginning of the hour, the election coverage is one of the most important things that our journalists do, both on the news side and on the endorsement and the editorial side. So please, if you have a chance, go to our websites. Last Sunday, we had terrific election coverage in the newspaper, and it's online right now. If you have a moment, also check out our Journey of Ballot video. If you're of an age like I am, you might remember Schoolhouse Rock, and it was done with that in mind, and it's a lot of fun. So again, thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to turn things back over to Sharon.
All right. Thank you, Sharon, for taking time out to host this event. And also thank you to our editorial board members, Ed and Dan, for giving us that much needed insight into our endorsement process. So like Sharon said, that brings us to the end of our event. I would like to thank you all for joining us for this hour. Please do take a couple of minutes to fill out the poll. It should be up right now. And you can fill it out as I close out this event. Also, I want to let you know that we will be sending out a recording of this webinar, so please be on the lookout for that. I'll also add that Journey of a Ballot link to that recording, so you can make sure that you watch that video. And make sure you check back on our events pages, as we will be updating it in the next couple of days with our next event, which is Gardening and Planting Indoors on November 12th at 10 a.m.